Again, good morning, everybody. Welcome to ICON, our monthly webinars where we bring together experts, researchers to talk about cover crop management and different aspects of that. So today we are happy to have Christine Elliott out of Purdue. And again, please, as you're connecting, can you please put your name, organization, occupation, and location in chat? And Helen, if we can go ahead and start with that poll. So just our usual poll, just trying to get everybody's knowledge coming into this talk. And I should note this is the final of 3 in our series this summer. So we've focused on pest management. So we've done weeds, diseases, and today we're going to get to hear about insect management to round out the series. So, yep, if you're continuing to do that poll, get your answers in pretty quick because we'll close that. Okay, probably just a few more seconds on the poll. And yes, please do continue to introduce yourself in chat. Okay, Helen, have we stopped the poll? Is that
Yeah,
correct?
I've
Okay,
stopped
we
it.
have shared. Okay, awesome. Cool. So we've got a little bit of familiarity, but still lots of room left to learn. So we're excited about that. Okay, next slide, if you will, Helen. Okay, so just like usual, today we're going to hear a presentation from Christine Elliott on insect management. We'll leave quite a bit of time for Q&A. So as usual, please put those in the chat or message us directly, and we'll be sure to get to those at the end, followed by some general updates from ICON and ISAP, and then just upcoming calls, that kind of information, before we close out with a CEU credit. So make sure you've got your apps handy if you are a CCA. Okay, if you will go to the next slide then, Elliot. Perfect. So I will go ahead and introduce Christine, our speaker today, while she's going ahead and sharing her slides. Um, so Christine Elliott is a doctoral candidate and USDA-NIFA AFRI pre-doc fellow in the Kaplan Insect Ecology Lab at Purdue University. Her research focuses on evaluating the impact of regenerative agriculture practices on insect biodiversity using traditional and cutting-edge monitoring methods. She received a Bachelor of Science degree from the University of Texas at San Antonio and a master's degree in entomology with a specialization in ecology, evolution, and conservation biology from the University of Hawaii at Manoa. While not in the field or engaging in science, policy, and advocacy, Christine enjoys playing the euphonium, practicing yoga, and spending time with her husband Tim and their sons Jacob and Finn. Christine, if you want to go ahead and share your slides, you are free to get going.
All right. Thank you so much for the introduction. Can everybody hear me okay? Great. And we're sharing the screen. Wonderful. All right. Thank you guys so much for being here. Thank you for the invitation to come and speak. Since that was a pretty thorough introduction, I'm just going to go ahead and jump right into the discussion about insect conservation in agroecosystems with a little bit of discussion about my PhD research. So without further ado, here's a quick overview just to kind of let everybody know the roadmap, where we're going to be going with this. I'm going to talk about the benefits that insects provide. Then I'm going to launch into my research and sort of what I'm discovering about how we can conserve insect biodiversity in agroecosystems. And then I'm going to talk just a little bit at the end about some of the changes that we can make to ensure insect biodiversity in agricultural fields. All right, so first off, the big question, why should we conserve insect biodiversity in agroecosystems? A lot of people, when they think about insects, they have pretty negative opinions, pretty negative perspectives on them. However, there are a lot of great reasons why we should try to keep them around in those fields. And that is because they provide a number of ecosystem services, things like pollination, nutrient cycling, and pest control. These are 3 of the big ones that I'm going to be talking about because these all have very clear financial benefits that they can provide. So for pollination, Indiana has between 400 and 500 native species of pollinators already. And pollination may not be a super important service for growers who are growing things like corn or soybeans. However, Illinois has more than 100,000 acres of farmland that are dedicated to specialty crops, horticultural crops that do really benefit from pollination. And when most of us think about pollinators, we think about honeybees, but honeybees are not native to the United States. And since Illinois already has all of these really great native pollinators, they tend to be better at pollinating crops than honeybees. So things like watermelons, tomatoes, blueberries, the native pollinators are going to be better at pollinating those. And that's going to show up for farmers as an increase in fruit set, as higher fruit quality. And you'll see that in those crops I just mentioned, as well as things like apples and pumpkins, which I had no idea prior to starting to prep for this call that Illinois is the country's leading producer of pumpkins. And I'm sure, at least in part, we can thank those native pollinators for that. So by utilizing native pollinators, farmers can reduce the cost of renting or purchasing non-native honeybee hives, and they can increase their yield and their profit. So insects do other things as well. They also do nutrient cycling, which can be really important for everybody. Insects are the primary decomposers, so they're going to be the things that are recycling dead plant material, dead animal materials, as well as animal waste. And so they're going to break those things down and release those nutrients back into the soil. Many insects also live and or burrow into the soil. So they're going to have some really positive impacts on soil texture, soil aeration, the ability of fields to hold water. And several insect groups are also considered soil engineers, things like ants and termites, but also dung beetles. I have a cute little video. Hopefully it will play for us and everybody will be able to see. So dung beetles are really important because they disperse waste and they act as biological control for pest species like hornfly or parasitic nematodes. By competing for those dung resources, they can actually reduce up to 95% of those negative pest species that can be impacting cattle, sheep, those sort of things that people may be raising in pastures. They're also really great for pasture systems because they increase forage availability, they reduce nitrogen loss, and again, they're going to be getting all of that nutrient back into the soil. Plus, I think that dung beetles are pretty adorable, so they have some aesthetic value in these ecosystems as well. And insects also provide a lot of natural pest control. So many insects are carnivorous. Some of them, like that's all they eat. Some of them, they will eat other insects, but they also will eat things like weed seeds. So not only are they providing insect pest control, but they can also provide weed control in fields as well. In agricultural fields, two of the primary insect groups that are acting as these natural predators to provide that pest control are ants and beetles. And these are the taxa that my research is currently focusing on. So in addition to insects that they may be eating, ground beetles also will eat slugs. They will eat those weed seeds, so they can really help control a wide variety of pests that you may be encountering in your fields. And insect predators can be extremely effective, which is why current research shows that things like prophylactic spraying for pests actually aren't as beneficial. It can actually reduce the benefits to farmers by spraying more frequently. And in multiple studies coming out of Purdue, they've shown that integrated pest management provides the biggest profit for farmers, regardless of the pest levels in the field. So even if you're paying someone to scout and they're going out and they're not finding anything, the research is showing that you are still going to benefit more from that because it allows you to take advantage of all of the free natural pest control that these species are going to be providing. So these natural predators, they're free, they just exist in the environment. They reduce growers' reliance on chemical insecticides. And a 2006 study estimated that insects provide $4.5 billion in natural pest control. So in today's dollars, that's more than $7 billion of natural pest control just in the US that you can take advantage of. And now for some of the slightly less practical reasons why I think insects are great and we should conserve them. Insects are integral to all terrestrial and freshwater habitats. So songbirds, fish, bats, they all rely very heavily on insect food sources. In Illinois, there are 13 insectivorous native bat species, and 6 of those are considered endangered or threatened. So even if you don't like bugs, preserving insect food sources is critical for preserving the populations of some other much more charismatic species. And lastly, insects have intrinsic and aesthetic value just of their own. So many people delight in seeing monarchs and are saddened when their populations take a dip. Insects really can lend to our sense of place. So if you imagine a nice warm evening in late spring and the sun is just going down and you're looking out into your yard and you're seeing these soft little sporadic flashes of light from fireflies and you're hearing the gentle call of crickets. Or if we fast forward to, maybe slightly later in the summer and the sun is going down and you're hearing that loud shrilling of cicadas. These are all characteristics of our environment that insects are providing. And if we imagine those evenings without those insects, it's a little bit sadder of a place, at least in my opinion. So at this point, hopefully I have convinced you that insects can be of benefit even in our agroecosystems. But you might be wondering, how do we reconcile conserving insects with the need to continue to grow food in a sustainable and profitable way? So agricultural intensification has been listed as one of the major drivers of insect declines. So by stepping away from those practices, many of you are already doing things that will prioritize insects, beneficial insects, in your field. And regenerative agriculture has emerged as a way to benefit the ecosystem health, to produce food in a more sustainable way, and also to sort of preserve the environment. And in my research, I'm investigating some specific aspects of regenerative agriculture. So things like reducing the use of pesticides, things like increasing your crop diversity through extended rotation and the use of cover crops, reducing disturbance in the fields by minimalizing tillage, as well as incorporating perennialization, both within the field, so things like growing alfalfa or having a grazing rotation, as well as extra field perennialization, so things like hedgerows or forests that are along the borders of fields. And I'm looking at how these things specifically impact insects. And that has led to these 2 specific research questions. So those questions basically can be summarized as, does regenerative agriculture actually benefit insects? And do some of those regenerative agricultural practices benefit insects more than others? And to get into those questions, I'm going to give you a little bit of an idea of how my research is set up. So I am working in 25 large-scale commercial ag fields that are sort of spread across the Midwest in the 3 I states, Iowa, Illinois, and Indiana. And these fields represent a spectrum of agricultural practices from highly conventional through to highly regenerative fields. And we kind of created this rough and ready working matrix to score where the fields fall on that regenerative spectrum. Some categories have 3 levels, low, medium, and high. Some are just binary. And the more regenerative practices are included in a field, the higher that regenerative score. So the scale that we've sort of come up just to work with right now maxes out at 14. And I have included fields that range from a 1 to 12. So again, the higher the number, the more regenerative practices are being incorporated in these fields. And you can see sort of those regenerative practices that I'm including. So crop diversity, how frequently they're using cover crops, the level of tillage that they use, how much chemicals are getting incorporated, livestock integration, as well as that perennialization. However, some of the research that I'll be showing a little bit later isn't going to be taking all of those factors into account. And In each of those 25 fields, I'm setting up 2 transects that are 40 meters long and contain 5 pitfall traps. You can see in the little picture there, that's what my pitfall traps look like. It's a 500 ml white cup that is sunk flush into the ground. I use a mixture of low toxicity antifreeze and water to act as the killing agent and the preservative for the insects that fall in it. And then the cage over the top helps keep the rain and the raccoons out. I kind of learned the hard way that raccoons and their grabby little hands are very interested in my pitfall traps in fields. So that is one of the ways that I've come up with to deal with that. And my work specifically looks at all of the ground beetles and the ants. And I am taking those and identifying those to species, and then looking at how the communities respond to those agricultural practices. And we're just going to jump right into the data now. So thinking back to that first question, does regenerative agriculture actually benefit insects? If it does, I would expect to find more insects in those more regenerative fields. And that's exactly the trend that we see, that for both ants and beetles, the higher the regenerative score, the higher the abundance of the individuals that we're finding in those fields. And we see that same trend for species diversity. The higher the regenerative score, the more diversity we're finding as well. So not just higher numbers, but also a lot of different species, which is important because different species are going to fit in different niches. And it's also going to provide sort of some functional redundancy. So the more species you have in your field, the more pest control you can expect to see. And so back to that first question. It seems like my data does support the idea that fields that incorporate more regenerative practices do have a higher abundance and a higher richness of these beetles and ants in their fields. So on to that second question, to investigate whether some regenerative practices are more impactful. With a small subset of my data, I ran non-metric multidimensional scaling analysis to see whether the communities of beetles and ants in these fields are different. So are we finding different things in different fields? And the data definitely supports that. The beetle communities do separate out kind of along the spectrum of regenerative practices, and running another analysis to see whether what's driving these differences. So what are the factors in the fields that are most influencing the way that the communities shape up? And cover cropping actually wound up being the most significant factor to predict how the species separate out. So how frequently the fields are incorporating cover crops is one of those primary drivers. And then to a slightly lesser extent, the use of chemical pesticides as well as in-field perennialization. At this point, I only have 1 year's worth of my 3 years of data. And with insects, typically we need to monitor them kind of long-term to really get an idea of what their populations are doing. So this is very preliminary data at this point. I'm in the middle of my 2nd year of sampling, and then I'll have a 3rd. So there will be more data, and these trends could change. But at this point, it's indicating that these are sort of the factors that are the most important in fields to those beneficial natural predators. So taking a look back at that second question, again, this initial preliminary data does support our second prediction as well, that some specific practices are more beneficial for insects than others. And from that, even though this is preliminary, there are some significant takeaways that come from that. And the main one is that cover crops can provide a diverse and persistent habitat at a landscape scale, which benefits insect diversity by creating additional habitat, additional resources for those species to take advantage of and continue to live. And also, the more frequently growers are incorporating cover crops, the better that also is for insects specifically. And along with that, there are also 2 other areas that were indicated as being pretty important. If you are looking to benefit insects in your field and maximize on those ecosystem services that I talked about, and those are reducing chemical inputs. So again, IPM comes up again and again in the research as a really effective way to maximize your yield and your profits, and minimize those additional expenses. And then also incorporating in-field perennialization. So having, an alfalfa or a grazing period in your rotations can also really increase the insect biodiversity and abundance, and therefore provide those better ecosystem services for you. All right, so that is kind of pretty much it for my talk. So we discussed why we should conserve insect biodiversity. I talked about a little bit of how specifically we can conserve them, what my research is showing benefits insects, and then also a little bit of discussion about what insect conservation can look like in those agroecosystems. And so before I totally wrap up, I need to acknowledge all of the growers that give me permission time and time again to go out into their fields to sample the insects. My technicians who help me, each year I put out 550 pitfalls. And so that's a lot of pitfalls to put out, a lot of holes to dig, a lot of species to identify. I'd never be able to do it without that help. My lab mates who are also great sounding boards, and then of course my funding sources. And with that, I am happy to take questions.
Awesome. Thank you, Christine. That was great. I will kick us off here with one question we've got in chat from Mike Rice. So he says, when you talk about cover crops, are you working in diverse crops or monocrops regarding the cover crops, I believe?
So we actually have a mixture of both, and that's one of the things. I hope that we have time to sort of discuss that with you guys at the end of this, because that's one of the things that we're sort of wrestling with that regenerative matrix that I talked about. How do we count cover crop species? So I actually have a mix of them. Sometimes the cover crops will be things like a Sabatier mix, where it is a wide variety of plant species that are included in that cover crop. And other times it's something like just cereal rye, where it's a single species. So we haven't really figured out exactly how we want to take that sort of diversity into account, but we are encountering both.
Awesome. Thank you. Would you actually go back to that slide with the matrix just so we can take a
Yeah,
look at
absolutely. Here we go.
Okay, perfect. So, one
Right
thing.
now, with our cover crop, all we've been doing is, are they incorporating a cover crop every couple of years? Are they incorporating cover crops kind of frequently, but not every year? Or are they including cover crops between all of their rotations? So that's sort of the low, medium, and high that we've been using right now. Um, but we've also been thinking about, looking at things at a more granular level. So do we want to include both for crop diversity? Right now, again, it's just low, medium, high, where if it's only one or two species, that falls in as low. I think we have 3 to 5 as medium, and then more than 5 species in their rotation as high. So do we want to actually get down to the granular level of what is the exact number? Or are we investigating deeply enough just by using these categorical variables?
Sure. Is there, and I think you maybe kind of already answered this, is there any accounting for length of regenerative practice? What would you hope, what would you think? Sometimes in these calls, we have people that are just starting out kind of on that path and people who have been doing it for 20 years. And I know you can't, every scenario is not the same, but what would you expect to see year 1, 3, 5, those kinds of changes between populations? Do things like ants take a longer time to bounce back than beetles, or what are your thoughts there?
So that's actually a great question. And as part of the spectrum, we do have fields that have been, just moved into organic versus ones that have been organic for, 2 decades or more. Um, However, balancing, reality with the data we'd like to have. Typically for our interviews, we've gone back 5 years. So we have, prior to the start of our research, we have 5 previous years of field history. Sometimes farmers are renting these fields and they haven't been in the fields that long, and it can be difficult to backtrack to try to figure out what was going on in these fields previously. So very anecdotally, I can say two of our fields have been inorganic practices for a decade or more. And just walking into the fields, you can hear the difference. I can hear the difference in the bird calls, in the insect sounds that I'm picking up. So I think that there definitely is an impact of time on what the insect communities are like in these fields, but I don't know how specifically we will be able to get into that with my data set.
Sure, that's totally understandable. Let me jump back here. We've got a question from Steve that I'll try to summarize. So Steve is just wondering, we hear a lot about bird population declines, and that a lot of times we hear that in tandem with insect population declines, right? The lack of windshield effect, right? Where, don't have to clean off the car near as much as we used to, even when I was growing up. Just general comments on decline of insects, if you have any insights on how that may proportionally impact bird populations, just anything about decline.
Yeah, absolutely. I have this slide as well. So yeah, there's been a lot of research into kind of the global broad scale decline of insects. And it's not just one or two insect families. It's kind of across the board that insects are declining in urban areas, in rural areas, in nature preserves. We see it as well. I have a different insect conservation talk that I often give where I go into this in a lot more depth and talk about how, insects are incredibly important. They are, like I mentioned, the primary building block of all terrestrial food webs, as well as all freshwater food webs. So many birds are insectivorous. And so by declining populations, as well as, it's not just insects are exposed to pesticide and that kills the populations. They can also be exposed to chronic levels where they're carrying those pesticides around in their bodies. And that can impact bird populations as well. So we definitely see reductions in especially songbirds. I think that's one that people really notice because they're loud. So not only are we seeing them, but we're hearing them. So we're really aware of them in our environments. And without that critical food source for them, it can be really bad. I think also of salmon with both, warming of water that is bad for them, as well as the reduction of insect populations, which make up the majority of their diet. It makes it hard for those populations to exist as well. So people that enjoy bird watching, people that enjoy freshwater fishing, going out on the lake, fishing in your rivers, fly fishing, all of those things are negatively impacted by the lack of insects. So even if insects aren't your favorite, they're still really important to probably some of those animal species that you do really enjoy.
Yeah, absolutely. Makes sense. Maybe just a question for our audience that we can tie back to in a few minutes while we answer a few more questions. But just, I know we've got a diverse group of folks on the call. So if there's any farmers or researchers or agronomists that have made a practice change and seen a shift in insect populations, we would love to hear about those insights. I'm sure that would be helpful for the group. I know personally, when we cut out insecticides, and I think maybe even one of our fields might be on that matrix, that we've seen a really great change in things like fireflies. I can see a firefly when I've been working after dark. I can see that down to the property line between us and other fields. So that's those kind of really cool changes, an amazing amount of beetles, that kind of thing. So yeah, if anybody has any insights from the group, we'd love to hear about it. While folks are thinking, we do have a question just again about that matrix. What crops are included in that? What would you say the majority of the breakdown of those crops are? I'm sure a lot of corn and beans.
Yeah. So one of the things that was important for me with my research is the insect communities that you find in, say, a grazing pasture versus what you find in corn are wildly different. So all of these fields include corn in their rotation at some point. Corn is sort of the through line for all of these. That way we can make some sort of equal comparison. Otherwise, like it just wouldn't make sense. In a forest and in a field, you're going to find very different insects. So I can't really draw any conclusions from that. However, by keeping corn as the through line, that sort of helps. So the majority of these are typically in row crops, although this year I've noticed a lot more small grain inclusion. So my first year, um, I think we might have only had one or two fields that were in a small grain. And this year, I don't know, probably almost half of them have included a small grain at some point during my sampling. So for my Indiana field, since that is where I'm based, they get visited 3 times throughout the year. And Illinois and Iowa, because they're further away, only get sampled once. And so it's been really interesting for me as a side note, especially in Indiana, where I'm going back to these fields time after time. And each week that I sample, I'm in the field at least 3 times. So there's a lot of visiting these fields, and you kind of develop a personal relationship with them. The fields definitely have certain characteristics, and I think it really helps that a lot of the fields that I am sampling in at least have human names. So I think that makes it even easier to personify them. Um, but yeah, it's been really interesting going in and seeing that. So the dominant crop that we wanted to make sure we included is corn. So there are a lot that are corn and soybean, just back to back, rotating through just those two. However, I do have fields that go into perennialization. So several that have either just transitioned into alfalfa or are in year 2 or 3 of alfalfa. And then also there's a mix of horticultural crops. So fields that are growing tomatoes and peppers specifically. I've had a couple of those last year and this year as well. So there's a pretty good mix.
Awesome, thank you. And I will pass it over to Tori. Sounds like he's got a question.
Yeah, Christine, great presentation. Enjoyed it very much. I have a question just regard this. This could be helpful for folks on the call. Are there certain indicator species or keystone species that you track specifically or look out for that could be an indicator of a rebounding population or maybe a declining population? Are there certain ones that stick out in your research that are of particular importance if you're finding them or not finding them?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So one of the reasons why I'm specifically using beetles and ants primarily in my research is that they have been shown to be really great indicator species, specifically within agroecosystems, and they're highly responsive to those changes in management practice. So ideally, at the end of this, I will be able to say, here are a couple of species that we really want to look out for. It's a little bit early for that. I feel like it's almost more like I know the opposite of that. So there are some species that I just find in every single field. Two carabids in particular jump to mind, Harpalus pennsylvanicus and Pteristicus melanarius. All of the fields, all of the time, they're always there. And I guess for ants too, there's one, its actual common name is the cornfield ant. So it's also highly prevalent across all 3 states. So I guess there's some that I'm finding specifically with tiger beetles. There are some that when I come across them, I know, oh, I'm not in Indiana anymore. So that can be fun. Ideally, there will be a couple of those species that like, oh, if we see this, we know we're in really good habitat. It would be great to come up with some of those, and that would be a wonderful thing to come out of this when I'm done.
Great, thank you.
I had a couple of questions here that I had wanted to get to about just general. You had talked about the financial impact of these beneficials and how great they are, and I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about just general facts about. I know I had seen some presentations years ago that I think the speaker made some kind of claim that beetles mostly just kill for fun. Like they don't even eat everything whole. They just go take chunks out of stuff. And so, one beetle can really take down a huge pest population. So, what are those benefits that we should see from things like ants, things from like beetles?
Yeah, so part of my research as well, although I didn't really discuss it today, is looking at like actually quantifying that pest suppression in the fields. And to do that, for each of those transects, I'm putting out predator assays. So it is like a vertebrate exclusion cage. It looks a lot like the raccoon cage from here. And within it, I'm putting 10 freeze-killed mealworms. And so in the lab, we weigh them all out so we know the exact weight of food that we're putting out in the field. And then we leave it out for 24 hours. We come back, we collect everything that's left, and ultimately figure out how much was actually eaten during this period. That way we can tie in, here's the abundance and diversity we found. Here are the regenerative practices in this field. And here's the level of pest control that we're finding based off of these things. Because yeah, I think that it can, be sort of nebulous to say, oh, well, they eat other insects, but like how much insects do they actually eat? So that is one of the things that I'm hoping to pull out of this. And I will say that this is my second year of doing those sort of predator assays and realizing that even in the very highly conventional, lower abundance sort of fields, there's a lot of pest suppression that's already going on. And so I'm going to need to sort of modify my methods because very frequently, especially in the really regenerative fields, I do go and like there's nothing to take back. So they ate everything that was there, which, I know at least they're at this level, but they could be providing, much greater pest suppression than I'm actually able to pick up. So that's one of the changes that I'll be doing moving into year 3 to try and get a better idea of that. But right now, it does seem like the more abundance, the more pest control you get. And the more abundance you get, that's based off of how regenerative your field actually is. So more regenerative practices, more pest suppression, but I can't exactly quantify that just yet.
Yeah, that's very, very interesting. Just the freeze-dried food and seeing what they're eating.
Yeah.
That's very cool. We do have a question here from Lowell in the chat. So Lowell Gentry does research with Eric Miller's farm, which I believe Lowell is saying is in the diverse Corn Belt trial. He's wondering if you've seen any differences specifically on his farm between a diverse crop rotation and the conventional 2-year rotation.
Yes, so there is one field in there that Lowell does work in. And at this point, I'm afraid I'm not really going to be able to say much about that, except that we do find the field is relatively conventionally managed. I've sampled it in soybeans my first year and in corn the second year. And both of the times we were finding, relatively good insect abundance, especially crickets in the soybean year, and visually seeing a lot of not so much beetles and ants, but some of the other natural predators. So this has been a really great year for hoverflies. Some people in Indiana call them sweat bees, although they are actually a syrphid fly. So really great seeing a lot of the adults as well as the larvae, which the larvae are the predaceous ones. The adults are great pollinators. So seeing a lot of those as well as a lot of lacewings. So finding a lot of adult lacewings in those corn crops this year.
Awesome. And that ties in, Julie, we will get back to your question in just a second, but that does tie in closely with a question that just came in. So just talking a little bit more maybe about what other species you are catching in those traps, if you are doing a specific ID on those, where those are being recorded. And then I've seen research on, taking a step further and saying, okay, these are beneficials and these are pests. So looking at the ratios in fields. So what are you finding in more in traps? And are you doing that kind of work as well?
Yeah, so I definitely find more beneficials than pest species. I guess probably some of that could be that my trapping method is specifically going to be capturing the things that are crawling along the ground primarily. So it's not very common to get any sort of caterpillars in those types of traps. Those are very rare just because that trap isn't going to catch that type of insect. I do occasionally see cucumber beetles. Those are probably one of the most common pests that I find, but I'm still finding them at way lower abundance than I'm finding carabids and ants. So that's good news, both that my trapping method is working for what I want to look at, as well as these species are in these fields and at much higher abundance than we're finding the pests.
Awesome. Yeah, that makes total sense. Let's see. Julie had a question here about just again that matrix. So if you could maybe put that back up real quick. And just going over again what that score of 14 would represent.
Yeah. So for each of the categories, for the ones that have like a low, medium, high, depending on whether it's a good practice or a bad practice. So for something like crop diversity, low crop diversity is going to be scored as a 0. So you don't get any points for that. Medium crop diversity gets you a point of 1, and high crop diversity gets you 2 points. Likewise, the same for cover crop use. Low is 0, high is 2. For tillage, that's going to be flipped. So low tillage gets you 2 points, medium tillage is 1 point, and high tillage is 0 points. So kind of judging whether reducing it is good or reducing it is bad, that's going to impact the number of points that you receive. And then for the binary categories like livestock and perennialization, a no is 0 points and a yes is 1 point. And so we just tally those up, and that determines the total score.
Okay. I wonder, obviously you have an ongoing project now, but just with some of the results that you've found, you started with this 1 to 14 or 0 to 14 scale. I wonder if your research could inform a different weighting of that scale. So since you found that cover crops are more impactful, any thoughts on, a more specific scale that's weighted?
Yeah, I would love for you guys to weigh in on that. If anecdotally there are things that you're seeing that, and it doesn't have to necessarily just be for insects. It could be that overall, in the general scheme of things, that you find the soil health improves if you do a specific thing, or anything like that. I'm very interested to hear, because this is still very much a document that is up for debate. We sort of needed something that was just rough and ready. That way, we could make sure that we're kind of covering all of the spectrum as well as possible. So tillage is one of those things that's kind of come out as being something that we may need to get more granular with, both because there is a very wide variety of tillage practices, as well as the history of tillage, and not just like what sort of tillage are you doing, but how frequently are you tilling throughout the season? So that's one of the areas that has really come up as something that we need to go and look at a little bit more. And as part of the Diverse Corn Belt Project, we do have a couple of groups that are really investigating soil health and are leading the charge for figuring out exactly how we want to weight tillage in this process.
Got it. That makes a lot of sense.
And then also, like we talked about, looking perhaps at the actual species diversity of cover crops, looking at the actual species in the crop diversity. Those might be things that wind up being really informative, or they might wind up being things that, we don't really need that level of information on. So that's definitely something that we're still going to be playing around with and trying to figure out, because regenerative agriculture is definitely getting very popular. It's getting much more well known, but we still there still isn't, at least in scientific circles, a really good definition of it. And so a really functional regenerative spectrum doesn't really exist yet. There are a lot of them that different researchers use for different reasons, that different companies use for different reasons. So one of the things that we're hoping to come up with is a really well thought out, practical and applicative regenerative spectrum.
Awesome. And there's a lot of us on this call that are involved with DCB in some way, either personally or professionally, or both. So we're really excited to hear this information and really see where it goes in the future. We do have a couple more questions that we'll try to hit here. Just I have to plead ignorance on this one, but okay, so we've got a question and it says, it's from Corey. It says, have you done any research on ants farming aphids with over-fertilization attracting aphids? Any?
So my research hasn't looked into that at all. However, I have always really been interested in ants, and my very first job while I was in high school was actually working for the USDA doing ant research specifically. So I have worked with ants a lot. And one of the things that I love about them is it seems like a lot of the things that humans pride themselves on, so things like having society, having a social structure, having good communication, things like farming and animal husbandry. Those are all things that ants did way before we did. So ants definitely do tend aphids, and that can lead to a wide variety of problems. It's something that I've experienced more in greenhouses than actually out in the field. Things like having an overabundance of aphid and then honeydew will lead to mildew problems. But that's not something that I've investigated in my research here in agroecosystems specifically. But that would be very interesting because the research on the actual benefits of ants tending aphids and it's kind of a little bit all over the place if you look at like meta-analyses and reviews of it. Sometimes they're beneficial, sometimes they're actually detrimental to them. So it would be really interesting to see some data in these agroecosystems to see whether ants are tying into the aphid populations because I definitely encounter aphids in the field. They aren't really something that I get in my traps, but as I'm sure you can imagine, and as probably most of you have experienced when you're walking through a cornfield, and the corn's up and tall and it's brushing all over you, and you wind up covered in a variety of things for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, I think this will be our last question. So we've got, um, let's see, a question from Lillian here that says, so, within within the matrix here, you do mention pesticides, and we've kind of brought that up, and maybe not a, I think maybe not a huge tie to the relationship of insects that we were thinking. Do you do any separating out of um, what those pesticides are? Is it herbicides? Is it all insecticides? How are you differentiating those?
Um, yeah, that's a great question. That is also a little bit of a tricky one, especially because um, we're looking at a I mean, ultimately when I'm done, I will have an 8-year history for the field in terms of these things. So um, some farmers keep, really impeccable, detailed records on exactly what they put out, how much, and when. But that isn't a universal practice. So right now, sort of what we've been doing is, like I talked about with cover crop use, is it something that they use every single year? Is it something that they only occasionally use, or is it something that they don't use at all because it is organic? So we are specifically only talking about synthetic pesticides. Um, but usually we aren't separating out, is it an herbicide? Is it a fungicide? Especially because a lot of times, like with treated seed, you can't get one without or you can't easily get one without the other. So that isn't really something that we are going that specifically into just because it's really challenging to get that level of data for all of the fields that are included in the study.
Yeah, absolutely. I think because we understand that nuance ourselves, just being insecticide free is a pain, and some people's view of what they're using or what not they're using, there's so much variation between farms. So we'd love to see more research on that one day, but totally understand the restrictions now. With that, in the interest of time, again, huge thanks, Christine. We've really appreciated this information. You've been just great. And actually, maybe if you put your last slide up so people can see again your contact information.
Yeah,
Perfect.
absolutely.
So yeah, folks, if you have additional questions that we didn't get to, or maybe need some more context for some of the questions, please do reach out to either us or Christine, and we can handle those questions. But again, thanks, Christine. We appreciate you being here today.
Yeah, it was my pleasure. Thank you all for being here and listening.
Awesome, thanks. And with that, I think we will, yep, share our screen. And Corey, if you're on the call, if you can talk about this survey a little bit.
Yeah, am on the call. Appreciate the opportunity. Um, just wanted to share this uh I guess it's a cover crop survey that Purdue and Cambridge are putting together to share, and it's farmer focused, 7 to 10 minutes, and it basically is directed at getting at the question of what incentives actually will get farmers to adopt cover crops. And I'm sure a lot of people on this call already do cover crops or already have thoughts and experience with this question. So I think anyone on this call, doing the survey would be appreciated. Also, sharing it out with the network or with your networks would be an awesome opportunity. And maybe we can get that PDF shared with the group so that they can share it widely. It's kind of an interesting story. Many of you probably know Shalom Armstrong at Purdue. He was outreached to from Cambridge. And what's happening over in the UK is I guess that they are in a very similar NLRS situation. But for whatever reason, they are a little bit behind in how to get farmers to willingly adopt cover crops. And so they are looking at the Midwest specifically and kind of nationally all of the US as a case study to try to understand how that incentive model might work. And so that's kind of what spurred this survey's creation. And then Shalimar put that together with them and is sharing it with his network. And I'm part of his network. And so he asked me to share it. And so again, that it's pretty simple. Ask, hit the survey. I think most of you, if you do the survey, you'll be like, oh, these are good, solid questions that we do need answers to. I know soybean, Farm Bureau, and I think perhaps corn are all going to share it with their grower networks too. I would love to get a strong Illinois answers to these polls just because I would love to know these answers for Illinois specifically. So, Frank, that's all I really have, unless there are some questions.
That's perfect. Thank you, Corey. And I do have your contact information there. Folks need to reach out about anything further. And we will. Looks like Helen did share a link in chat if folks need that. And then in the follow-up to the call, we can make sure that we send that out as well. And then with that, Helen, if you want to the next slide, please. Perfect. So just usual. Again, we will have our usual all call for any follow-up events that folks are doing in the network. So while you're thinking of that, just again, want to touch on resources. We do have a ton of blogs and videos. We often summarize these ICCON calls and other content into blog posts. So please do, if you have questions or need a refresher on something, we do have a ton of resources. And also, we're very open to if you have suggestions as well. So if there's any resources we don't have or that you've seen in another state and you want adapted to Illinois, we're always very happy to take those requests. So please do reach out for that. Next slide. Like we've talked about before, it's almost a year now, I think, that we've put out what we called our introduction to soil health practices. So really taking that Illinois focus on challenges that folks have and maybe some issues that they can solve with conservation practices in Illinois. So that's available online, and we also have physical copies if you need those. Actually, we've had people take physical copies in bulk, right, for various events or classrooms, that kind of thing. So please do let us know if you need any of those. And Helen has linked to those as well. Okay, next slide. Perfect. And we've also put out a cover crop seed dealer directory. A big question that folks often bring to us is, where do I get seed? Maybe my retailer doesn't work with seed yet. Where do I get those? And so we've got a directory here with additional information on there where folks are at. And also sometimes that they're doing additional services as well. So maybe they offer planting services as well. So that's a great resource that we've linked to. Okay, and Helen, did you want to talk about the funding for the Find tool?
Sure, yeah. We just wanted to share kind of a suite of these resources that we've put together that are helpful as farmers are starting to think about planting cover crops this fall. So the Find tool was launched in July. I think we shared about it at a previous ICCON call, but I just dropped a link in the chat there. It's a directory or a database of over 60 financial incentive programs that can be filtered by geography and operation type. You can filter down for practices for programs in your county that will pay for cover crops, as well as several other both in-field and edge-of-field practices. So we hope it's really a useful tool for farmers to get connected with some of these incentive incentive payment programs.
Awesome. Thanks, Helen.
Yeah.
And just as we continue to wrap up here, we will be showing the CEU slide here in a second, so make sure you get those apps ready. But just a reminder that we will be canceling the October call like we often do. It's harvest time, right? So go have fun, be safe, and always reach out if you need anything during that time, but it'll be a little quiet around here for sure. So just another all call. If there are any events or field days coming up, I know the season is slowing down a little bit, but we just did want to give folks a couple of seconds if they've got some events to pitch. And while folks are thinking about that, we may throw up a poll here just to see real quick what folks thought of the call and what we can do to improve in the future. And lastly, there is that CEU slide for y'all.
Can you see the poll, Frank?
Yes, the poll is up on my perfect, and we've got questions we got answers rolling in. I know we're asking a lot for folks to fill out the poll and do the CEU code.
Oh, but I think it's good at the same time. Then if you're
Yeah.
CEO, then you can do the poll. And yeah, if people have webinars or other things to share with the network, feel free to drop links into the chat or go ahead and come off mute and tell us a little bit about what you have coming up.
And we do have an events page at ISAP where we do try to be a clearinghouse for those. So if you ever need to share any upcoming events, please do just shoot us a note and we can add those to that page. But it looks like we've got just about everybody in on that poll. So, yep, looks like we all learned a lot. But yeah, if there are further questions that come up later, please do reach out. And with that, again, huge thanks to Christine for her time today and knowledge. And yeah, we'll be in touch as the next ICCON schedule comes out. Thanks, everybody.